Thank you for listening to the History of the Papacy. I'm your host, Steve, and we are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, including Scott Rank's History Unplugged podcast, James Early's Key Battles of American History, and Richard Lim's This American President podcasts. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. It's a great site, and they're working on it and adding to it. It's really cool. I'd like to just quickly mention we are on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy. It's the holiday season and it's a time of giving. If you are in the position, I know times are tough for everyone out there, but if you're in the position to help out the podcast, I would just really, really appreciate your help by becoming a patron on patreon.com. It really helps just keep the lights on, keep this whole operation going. And there's some benefits for you. And most importantly, the biggest benefit for you is being on the History of the Papacy diptychs. But not only will you be listed on the History of the Papacy diptychs, there's bonus audio, video content, Pope coin, monthly book drawings, early content, and ad-free content. So sign up early so your name is on the top of the lists. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William, Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, and Sarah at the Alexandria level. We have Doppo, Paul, Justin, and Alana, all of whom are magnificent at Constantinople and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great. Now, all the way back in 2019, a much simpler pre-pandemic time, Dr. Max Gulker and I presented you a unique Christmas present. That year, we looked at the Cadaver Synod and the Dark Ages Papacy from the lens of an economist. This year, to add on to that wonderful Christmas present of the Cadaver Synod, we're giving you more Cadaver Synod. This year, Max and I are joined by Dr. William S. Monroe. Dr. Monroe is the subject librarian for medieval studies and other related subjects at Brown University. While doing that full-time job, he also completed a PhD from Columbia University with a focus on the life, career, and afterlife of Pope Formosus of Cadaver Synod fame. Dr. Monroe literally wrote the book on the Cadaver Synod. Almost any video, cartoon, or anything you read, see on YouTube, etc., will have used Dr. Monroe's years of research on the Cadaver Synod as one of their main sources. After the first Cadaver Synod episode, Max and I had so many questions hanging out there, we had to talk to the man himself. Now, as you well know, Max Gulker is a multiple-time guest of the History of the Papacy podcast. He's a senior fellow at the Reason Foundation and holds a PhD in economics from Stanford, and with a research focus on poverty and social policy. I am very honored to be joined by Doctors Monroe and Gulker. I really think you will enjoy this episode, and I wish you all and your families a Merry Christmas. Share the present of the Cadaver Synod with your friends and family. They will never be able to thank you enough for sharing this incredible piece of history with them. With that, here's the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. I'd like to welcome Dr. William S. Monroe to the History of the Papacy podcast today. We're really excited for this one. And also joining me today in hosting duties is Dr. Max Gulker. We're going to talk about a topic that just never gets old, and there's always more to discuss. It's probably one of the most bizarre and not well understood topics in the history of all of Christianity. Let's leave it there. So, Max, why don't you get us rolling here with talking about this wonderful topic of the Cadaver Synod?
Yeah, well, we're really here to listen to Dr. Monroe, and because it's very exciting to have an opportunity to learn a lot more about this. There's I think something we've run into is that there's been a limited amount of information. But let me just ask you to start something I can relate to as a PhD student. You meet somebody, you're talking to a family member. Oh, what's your research on? Obviously, if I'm not mistaken, it's your dissertation is on the Cadaver Synod. A lot of people don't know that. How do you tell them about it briefly? What kind of responses have you gotten? That type of thing.
Well, that's it is hard to give that kind of information in a minute. The elevator talk.
Right.
It's kind of when people do ask me what I research, and this actually was my dissertation, but I've been working on it. I just defended it actually in March, last March, but I've been working on it for some 20 years. And was lucky that actually Columbia University allowed me to defend it after all that time. But I fortunately had the support of my committee, who were very good. But what I say generally is it's about Pope Formosus more and than the Cadaver Synod itself. And I always say that Pope Formosus is known for essentially one thing, and that is the fact that he was hauled out of his tomb and put on trial after his death. And that generally piques people's interest, certainly. But Pope Formosus himself had a long career in the church before that, and which is important. And that what I was trying to do is to explain why his enemies would go to such an extreme as to put his corpse on trial, to disinter him and put the corpse on trial. So, and none of the current explanations that I had read made sense to me. So I decided to look into this. I thought it would be relatively easy, but it's not. It wasn't easy because of a lack of sources, really. So
the first thing for me when you bring that up are, what are some of the points, like what's maybe one of the main points that is the traditional telling that just didn't make sense to you?
Yeah, the traditional telling is that the main one is that he had, it's long been said that it was the Spolatans who put him on trial, or it was at their urging. Lambert, actually, it was Guido's son, Lambert, and his mother, Agiltrude, who spurred this. And that was because, it's a very complicated situation, but it's the end of the Carolingian Empire. The last Carolingian emperor was Charles III. And after the death of Charles III, there was a vacuum. There were no more legitimate Carolingians to take up the throne. And so the Pope before Formosus, Stephen V, had crowned Guido of Spoleto as emperor. He was the Duke of Spoleto, and then later Formosus also crowned his son as a co-emperor. That was Lambert, and when on Guido's death, then Lambert became emperor. So, and these are referred to usually in English as Guy. Guido is Guy, or Guido in Italian. So it's, but I prefer to use the Latin form. But it's so anyway. So, and then at some point, Arnulf, he is a Carolingian, but an illegitimate son. And he was illegitimate son of Charles, not Charles, may have been Charles III. These things are complicated. He got the idea. He was ruling in Germany at the time, what's now Germany, and he cemented his reign as king there and got the idea of invading Italy and becoming emperor. He thought it was time he should be emperor. And he invaded Italy, captured Rome, and was crowned emperor by Formosus. now, as I said, who earlier had crowned Arnulf, was the German king who then had invaded and captured Rome, was crowned emperor by Formosus, and then went out to fight against Lambert to defeat him. But Arnulf was struck by some kind of paralysis. He had a stroke or something and had to go back to Germany. So Lambert won by default and then came back. And it has long been said that it was Lambert and Adgeltrude who forced Stephen VI to take revenge on Formosus for having left, abandoned Lambert and crowned Arnulf as emperor. So because Formosus had died, we have to look at the chronology here. Arnulf invades Rome and captures it in late February, I think. And then by April 4th, Formosus died. So he survived only about a month after the capture of Rome. And meanwhile, Arnulf had gone out to fight Lambert and had been paralyzed and ended up having to go back to Germany and leaving this behind. And Lambert then resumes his, well, he was always emperor, at least in his eyes. And he and his mother eventually returned to Rome, not immediately. It's always said that when Arnulf captured Rome, it was being held at that time by Adgeltrude. She was leading the opposition because actually Lambert had gone to what's now France to seek aid at that time. And so that's why he wasn't even there when Arnulf invaded. And so, but Adgeltrude fled Rome when it was captured. And so a lot of this is I see it spurred by some misogyny. Adgeltrude obviously was a powerful woman, and a lot of people just can't see that. And some of the quotations that are in some of the modern literature on this, especially by Louis Duchesne, who was a great historian of the papacy. But I think there were a lot of assumptions made that I think are false in this whole thing. So what I concluded, and this is maybe I should say, is that in fact Formosus did not abandon Lambert and was probably forced to crown Arnulf, and maybe was even abused in that whole process, and maybe that's why he died just a month later. And so, I mean, that's all. I have no proof for that, but the evidence for Formosus having invited Arnulf to invade, and that's the evidence that has been given, is that Arnulf, both Stephen V earlier and later Formosus had sent secret letters to Arnulf asking him to invade and save Rome from these bad Christians, meaning the Spolatans. But there's no firm evidence of that. And I think that was probably invented by Arnulf and his followers, or maybe there were some letters that may have been forged. These letters at one point were supposedly delivered by Berengar, who was the Count of Friuli in the northeast of Italy. And he had fought against Guido to become emperor earlier, or to become king of Italy earlier after the death of Charles III. So it's possible, and we know that Berengar did ally himself with Arnulf in his first invasion of Italy, and then again in the second invasion, but he abandoned Arnulf in both cases during the invasion. So anyway, so that's that explanation. That has always been the main explanation, that this was the revenge of Lambert and Adgeltrude for having abandoned Lambert and crowning Arnulf as emperor.
And now a word from our sponsors.
All of that story sounds like the type of conflicts one would expect, in this complicated medieval web of states and, principalities and the Vatican. None of those other conflicts, as far as I know, ended up in one pope actually digging up the corpse of another pope, putting him all in papal garments, and putting him on, with all of this sort of ecclesiastical pomp and circumstance, apparently with bishops watching, with, is it something about that time period and that situation, or are we just dealing with a crazy person somewhere along, in your best speculation?
I'll have to say, when I first learned about this, or started reading about it seriously, as I said, a lot of the explanations, I think, didn't explain it. Yeah, even that one, in some ways. For one thing, I doubted it because Formosus, as I said, had a long career in the papacy, in the church. He was bishop of Porto, outside of Rome, and had been sent to Bulgaria by Pope Nicholas I to help with the conversion of the Bulgarians to Christianity. And the king of Bulgaria really liked Formosus and kept asking Nicholas I and later Hadrian II, who followed him, to make Formosus the archbishop of Bulgaria. And both of them refused to do this, saying that Formosus had to return to Rome because he had his own diocese to take care of. Porto is the port of Rome, or was at that time the port of Rome, and it's just on the coast outside of Rome. So, but the bishops of Porto were very important in Rome. They were one of the 7 what are called suburbicarian bishops, these important bishops of dioceses just surrounding Rome. And they played an important role. The Bishop of Porto was one of the 2 bishops who would crown or ordain the new pope. When someone became Bishop of Rome, Pope, he had to be crowned by 2 other bishops or ordained by 2 other bishops. And that was, it was the Bishop of Porto was one of them generally. And, or it might be, if Formosus was away, which he was, when, for instance, Hadrian II became Pope, it had to be one of the other suburbicarian bishops. So these were very important bishops. They were the cardinal bishops. This was before the College of Cardinals and the cardinals as we know them today. All the cardinals at that time were the 7 cardinal bishops that surrounded Rome, and also there were cardinal priests in Rome and cardinal deacons in Rome. These were all worked together closely with the papal court, and these were called cardinal because they were important. The cardinal, it comes from the word cardo, which is the hinge. So they were hinges of the papal government, essentially.
So it seems like you have really 2 parallel tracks going on. There's religious politics going on, and then the secular politics. How did those 2 smash? Are those the things that smash together to make this unusual situation?
That is at least the way the Synod of Ravenna, which overturned the Cadaver Synod, tries to paint it. I don't think that's necessarily so, but let me say what led me to believe that this was not the revenge of Lambert and Adgeltrude is essentially that Formosus had always sided with the Spolatans. I mean, he had written to Fulk, who was the Archbishop of Reims in France, sent numerous letters to him in which he and Fulk, I should say, Fulk was distantly related to Lambert and to Guido. These Dukes of Spoleto were translated. I mean, they had come to Italy from France, I should say, I'll say France because that's what it is today, but it was Western Francia, the kingdom of Charles the Bald, the kingdom of that he was the king for most of this time, and then emperor for a while. But these people had been moved to Italy after Charlemagne conquered Italy and took it from the Lombards. He brought in nobles from Western Francia to replace the Lombard rulers there in Spoleto and Tuscany. And so these people had come from Western Francia. Now it's again, I felt I had to look at the long career of Formosus, and it was a controversial career in many ways. You may know that he had been exiled from Rome earlier when he was Bishop of Porto. What happened is he spent some time in Bulgaria, and again, as I said, the Bulgarian king really liked him and wanted him to be archbishop there, but he was recalled to Rome. And it's always said that the reason they would not make him Archbishop of Bulgaria is that he was already a bishop. And this is an important issue. I think it's sometimes made too important in the history of the Cadaver Synod, is that at that time, it was against canon law to be translated from one see to another. So a bishop was considered married to his see. This goes back to the Council of Nicaea, a canon of the Council of Nicaea, which says that a bishop cannot be translated from one see to another. But there's always an out. There's a loophole. It says, except in case of necessity. And this was simply to keep bishops from doing this themselves, that to move, because it was always thought, a bishop maybe of a smaller city might want to move to a bigger city, a richer city to, and become bishop there. So they didn't want this to happen in the early church. And so they passed this canon that said a bishop cannot be translated from one see to another. But they did say, except in case of necessity. And this often happened. It's sometimes said that Marinus, who was Pope after John VIII, was the first pope to be translated from one see to another. But in fact, it was Peter. If Peter was actually Bishop of Rome, he had been Bishop of Antioch before that, and that he would have been the first bishop to be translated from one see to another.
Nice.
Formosus was recalled to Rome, and they sent instead two priests to work with Khan Boris of Bulgaria, Boris Michael. And he didn't like them, and actually they were sent back. He sent them back, and he turned back to the Byzantines to send him a bishop. So because of the refusal to grant a bishopric to Bulgaria or let Formosus, or in fact Marinus, when Formosus went to Bulgaria, he went with another bishop, Paul of Populonia, but also on that same journey, Marinus, who was a bishop, also went along, and he was on his way to Constantinople at the time to meet with the emperor there, the patriarch of Constantinople. But he was refused entry to the Byzantine Empire, and he stayed for a while in Bulgaria and then returned to Rome. So Formosus and Marinus had known each other quite well. And let me say, after Formosus returned to Rome, he was called upon for other duties, other important, very important duties. He was asked to ordain the followers of Cyril and Methodius, including Methodius himself. Now, Cyril and Methodius were the apostles of the Slavs, and they were sent by the Byzantine Empire to help convert the Slavic peoples. And they were from the East. They were Greek speaking, but they knew the Slavic languages. And of course Cyril created an alphabet to write Slavic, which is not the Cyrillic alphabet that we know today, but was an earlier, what's called the Glagolitic alphabet for the Slavic languages. But Cyril had died before they got to Rome. Cyril and Methodius were coming to Rome to get papal support for converting the Slavs. And they arrived there shortly after Formosus came back to Rome. And Formosus was asked to ordain Methodius and his other followers so that they could return to the Slavic lands and continue on their mission to convert the Slavs. And my feeling is the reason he would have been asked to do this is because he was highly regarded in Bulgaria, and so that would give them a lot of credibility among the Slavic peoples.
So was it that Formosus, he's gathering up power all along, and he's forming would you say that he had a strong faction behind him?
I think he did, and he did later, at least. What happened in the end is that when John the Eighth became Pope, John was quite different and was from the earlier popes, and he changed a lot of the policies and things. And he had sent also Formosus and two other bishops into, let me say, this is another important point. At this time, for a long time, Louis II was the emperor during much of this time in the early part of Formosus's career. And Louis II is often kind of disdainfully referred to as the Emperor of Italy because he spent most of his life in Italy. And he was, after his brother Lothar II died, Louis became the emperor. But he was still in Italy. He had really, Charles the Bald was king in France. Louis I was the king in Germany, so East and Western Francia. And Lothar was the king of the Middle Kingdom, which included Italy. It included all of what was later called Lotharingia. It was from the Low Countries, south in between France and Germany, and was fought over by France and Germany for centuries, and down into Italy itself. And so Louis II, by that time, Charles the Bald and Louis I, who were brothers or half-brothers, fought over the Middle Kingdom up in the north. But Louis was the emperor, and he basically only controlled Italy. When Louis died, there was a question of who might become emperor, and Louis's wife was related to the East Frankish, line, and she wanted one of them to become emperor, and that would have been either Louis I, but he was old by that time, and they wanted his son, Karlmann, to become emperor. And they met with John VIII about this, but instead John VIII sent these three bishops to Western Francia to invite Charles the Bald to become emperor instead. And he came and was crowned emperor in 875. And so that was a key thing. But afterward, for some reason, we don't know why, Formosus and John VIII fell out. And Formosus and a whole lot of other people in Rome, key figures in the papal court, fled Rome in the middle of the night. And this was in 876. And they went and were protected by the Spoletans. They went to the Duchy of Spoleto and were protected there. And let me say that the Spoletans had been designated as the protectors of Rome by the emperors, by Charles the Bald. When Charles the Bald came and was elected emperor, he didn't stay very long in Rome. And he went back, he had to get back to West Francia because he was being attacked by Louis I, or the Louis the German, Louis the German in emperor, and also the Viking invasions. So he had a troubled time back there in West Francia and his kingdom. So he didn't stay very long in Rome, and he designated the Duke of Spoleto as the protector of Rome. So when Formosus and these other people fled Rome, they went to Spoleto. And then later, Formosus himself went into exile in West Francia. Now, John VIII put out a call for these people to return to Rome and face trial for something. In the letter that he sent out, he talks about various crimes. They had conspired to turn the city over to the Saracens. They had done. They were treasonous to the emperor and things like this. But the fact that Formosus later went into exile in Charles the Bald's kingdom, although for most of this time Charles the Bald was dead because he died not too long afterwards. It's kind of strains credibility. I mean, why would he go into into exile in Charles the Bald's kingdom if he was against? And so it's often been said in the standard literature that Formosus was pro-German and John VIII was pro-French. This is how Louis Duchesne paints it, and certain other most of the other modern historians they talk about this division between those who favored the German side of the Carolingian line and those who favored the French side. So it's often said that Formosus was pro-German and he wanted the German side to take the imperial king side, and that's why he later asked Arnulf to invade as well, because that was the German side. But in fact, my feeling is probably that it was Formosus himself who promoted the idea of Charles the Bald becoming emperor. And that's why he was sent on this mission to invite him. But that John VIII was disappointed with this, because the reason he wanted to crown an emperor is that he needed help against the Saracens. The Saracens were, attacking lots of cities in the south. They had earlier, in fact, attacked Rome, and he wanted a strong protector from the emperor. And Charles the Bald came, got crowned emperor, and then quickly returned to Francia. That's not what he wanted. He wanted someone like Louis II, who was going to be in Italy and spend his time there and help fight against the Saracens. But instead, Charles the Bald invited or designated the Spoletans to do this. So I think that's the main reason, I think, for the falling out of Formosus with John VIII. But it's hard to tell. But I think John VIII made up this story about the turning over the city to the Saracens and all this other stuff and these people. And Formosus went into exile in Rome. I mean, in West Francia, was there for years, and at some point after the death of Charles, after the death of Charles III, John VIII went back to, I guess this is maybe before Charles III. Again, it's the chronology. It's a very complicated. But John VIII went to West Francia to try to find somebody else who would help in the fight against the Saracens. And he traveled through West Francia, held a synod in Pontillon. There was an earlier synod in Pontillon before John got there, but he held a synod in Troyes, a bishopric east of Paris. And there, at that synod, after that synod, it is said that he met with Formosus, that Formosus came to him and he asked, he wanted to be restored to communion. And John VIII made him swear an oath that he would never return to Rome and never try to regain his bishopric. And with that, and Formosus apparently signed this oath in a book. I'd love to find that book. But he signed this oath in his own hand, as it said, and he was restored to lay communion. John VIII returned to Rome, and Formosus stayed there, and in West Francia. But then John VIII was assassinated, the first pope to be assassinated, and then
pretty much everyone after that.
Well, there were attempts before, Leo III, people had attacked him. They apparently cut out his tongue and things like this, but there were, so there were attempts before, but John VIII was the first to actually be assassinated. And after that, Marinus became pope, and Marinus invited Formosus to return to Rome and restored him to the bishopric of Porto. So again, here we have Marinus, who had been the colleague of Formosus earlier on this journey to Bulgaria, restored him to his bishopric. Now, also, another thing I forgot to say here is that another thing another accusation John VIII made against Formosus was that Formosus had tried to become pope when John VIII became pope, that they struggled over the papacy, but there's no other evidence for that anywhere, and so it's a problem that we don't have a lot of sources for a lot of these things because the Liber Pontificalis, which is this history of the popes from the beginning up to the last full life in it is the life of Hadrian II, and then John VIII becomes pope. There's no life of John VIII. There's no life of Hadrian III or Marinus, and then there's a partial life of Stephen V that's incomplete. So and that's only in a few of the manuscripts. So the Liber Pontificalis essentially stops with Hadrian II. So we don't have the life of John VIII, who was pope for 10 years. I mean, he was a major pope and a powerful pope, and for some reason, these lives at the time were written by people close to the popes. They were written right after the pope died and added to the Liber Pontificalis, but it didn't happen in these cases. So one of our major sources for papal history just dies out at this time. And then other sources, as you know, the acts of the Cadaver Synod itself were overturned by the Synod of Ravenna, and unfortunately, the Synod of Ravenna ordered them to be burned. So we don't have the acts of the Cadaver Synod, so we only have secondhand accounts of this.
And now a word from our sponsors.
I was going to say one of my favorite things that you mentioned on your website, where you summarize all of this. I think, is it WilliamMonroe.com? Should
yes.
say that when we say
well, WS, it's WSMonroe.com.
WSMonroe.com. You can go visit there. But is that they, in both the Cadaver Synod and the Synod of Ravenna, they made it very clear they weren't judging popes somehow, yes. Right? And so you dug them up out of the ground and you sat them here, but we're not judging him.
You know, there is an old dictum that says, you know, the prima sede san nemine judicator. That is that the first see shall be judged by no one. So the Pope is God's vicar on earth, and so, you know, he is not to be judged by anyone else, and he is to judge everyone else. You know, Peter was given the keys, and what you shall bind and loose on earth shall be bound and loose in heaven. You know, so so it's the Pope who makes the big decisions, and is not to be judged by any other person, whether lay or cleric.
Well, I was going to say earlier, congratulations on exhuming your 20-year-old PhD and putting it on trial, so to speak. I'm glad it went better than it did for Formosus. But you also said right in the beginning, and you kind of say in your written summary of all of this, why go to all this trouble? And that issue with the papal judging even is another source of trouble. It just seems like an almost unprecedented thing to do and a very strange thing to do.
It is a strange thing to do. And the conclusion I came to, and again, it's the real reason for it. I mean, I think the real reason for it, there were these factions. They were aligned with John VIII and his followers and with Formosus. And I don't think that Formosus really did struggle with John VIII over becoming Pope. I mean, Formosus was always accused of being ambitious and wanting to become Pope. And I don't think we have any real evidence for that, except this letter of John VIII, which accuses him of trying to become Pope when John VIII became Pope. And they also accused him of making a pact with Boris to allow no one else to become, you know, Archbishop of Bulgaria or Bishop of Bulgaria, that he sort of made, he conspired with Boris to not accept anyone else. But Boris, in fact, did accept Marinus. He said he would accept Marinus as a pope or as bishop or Formosus, one or either of those. But the popes would not agree with that. So there were these factions. I mean, Formosus was considered by many to be a very holy person, and a lot of people really liked him. But you know, the followers of John VIII did not like him for some reason. And again, we don't have any real evidence for why they fell out, what happened. I don't believe this letter of John VIII that accuses him of all these crimes, but we don't know for sure. But at least he was invited back and restored to his bishopric. That was another thing he was accused of in the Cadaver Synod, supposedly, was perjury, because he had violated his oath to not return to Rome and take back his bishopric. But Marinus had absolved him of that oath, and popes could do that. I mean, Louis II had been captured by one of a Duke of Benevento earlier during his battles with the Saracens. After he liberated Bari from the Saracens, he was captured on his return to Rome by the Duke of Benevento, who held him for a while, captive for a while, and then released him, but made him swear an oath not to take revenge on him or something like that. But John VIII himself absolved him of that oath. So that can be done by a pope. So, you know, if they said this was, you know, this oath was extorted from him, you know, I mean, he had to do it in order to become, you know, be restored to lay communion. But there are several. The most important sources are the Synod of Ravenna itself, and the the writings of Auxilius, who was a Neapolitan priest, who was one of those who had to be reordained after he was Formosus's ordinations were annulled. And that's another strange thing. Why annul his ordinations? And again, the one reason often given is that it absolves Stephen VI of the same crime that Formosus was accused of, being translated. So he was apparently accused of perjury for violating his oath never to return to Rome and take back his bishopric. And then he was also accused of being translated from one see to another against canon law. And he was accused, and that one, Stephen VI was also guilty of. So because he had been Bishop of Anagni before Formosus made him Bishop of Anagni, and then he became Pope. So he would have been guilty of the same thing. So it's said that he did this in order to absolve himself of that same crime. But he wouldn't have had to do that. None of these things were necessary. All of these things, and I concluded that the main reason they would have to do this is that I think a cult was probably growing around Formosus's tomb. Some people thought he was a saint and perhaps even a martyr, because if Arnulf forced him to crown Arnulf emperor, he may have been tortured, he may have been abused, and he died, as I said, just a month later. And some people may have considered him a saint and a martyr. And I think perhaps a cult was growing around his tomb. And one way to stop that, nip it in the bud, would be to get rid of the body, first of all. But
we need
also
a reason to dig him up.
Yeah. Also to desecrate the body, because it was often considered that it would be impossible to desecrate the body of a saint. The saint wouldn't. There are lots of saints' tales in which somebody tries to do some harm to a saint's body, or even move a saint's body from one place to another, and they get paralyzed, or something happens, they drop dead, or something like that. So the first canon of the Synod of Ravenna says, the synod celebrated in the time of Pope Stephen VI of pious memory, that is our predecessor, in which his grave violated, the body of the venerable Pope Formosus was dragged across the ground and brought as if to trial, and presumed to be judged and condemned, which was never heard of in the times of our predecessors. We completely nullify, and we forbid that anyone attempt to do such a thing again. A dead person should not be called to judgment, because when a person is called to judgment, he is called so that he might answer in his defense. That's an important thing. And it is clear to everyone that the body of a dead person can neither respond nor make satisfaction. So the body was desecrated. It was removed from its tomb and, as it says, dragged across the ground, which is an interesting thing to include there. And then it was put on trial. And then it was buried in a pauper cemetery somewhere, and immediately dug up again overnight and thrown into the Tiber with weights on it to hold it down, as Auxilius tells us, or there are some other writings that refer to these things. And it was miraculously found and hidden until Stephen VI was strangled in prison, and then was reburied again in St. Peter's. So I think what they tried to do is nip this in the bud, this incipient saint cult around Formosus, because his enemies could not bear this. And it was long said that Lambert and Agiltrude were present at the Cadaver Synod, but that has been shown to be false long ago, actually, by an Italian historian. So I think it was not the revenge of Lambert and Agiltrude, but it was really this issue of this faction that really did not, really hated Formosus for some reason, and why we're not clearly sure, but it was the faction that was aligned with John VIII and had something against him.
I love that the Council of Ravenna 4 years later sounds almost as confused and sort of mortified as we are. like, oh, by the way, in case anybody else gets this idea, you can't put a dead person on trial because they can't answer. It's like, in no uncertain terms. So it sounds almost like somebody, whether it was Stephen or somebody else, was a little weird in all this. Just had a strange sort of, wasn't just following custom.
That's a possibility too. Stephen was one of those people who just had something against Formosus, and we don't know why. I mean, Formosus had ordained him Bishop of Anagni. Why?
And then putting a dead person on trial wasn't completely out of the question. There was Origen. His ideas got put on trial, the 3 chapters, but they didn't dig them up and put them. Yeah, it seems like that whole sainthood and that the veneration of Formosus is the thing that kicked it up to the next level.
Yeah, and I give examples in my dissertation of other saints or people who might have become saints whose bodies were dug up and gotten rid of. There's a later medieval case. There was actually a Byzantine emperor whose body was dug up and buried because he had a strong following, and the current emperor didn't like this. and so there were various people who were very much revered and may have become saints and were, dug up or removed from their tombs and their bodies were burned. John Wycliffe, I think you mentioned this in your earlier thing. I think that Wycliffe was also, he was a reformer, an early reformer, and he was dug up and his body was burned. And this was, to prevent any relics, because to have a saints cult, essentially you almost need some kind of relic, even if it's only what we call I can't think of the name, a contact relic, like an item of their clothing or something like that. But and I often wonder, it said they cut off his 2 or 3 fingers. The sources disagree whether it was 2 or 3 fingers with which he would ordain people. They cut those off and of his body. And I often wonder if they did that as to hedge their bets, that if he became a saint, they might want those relics. Someone might want those relics of his fingers.
Maybe this was just excellent PR if they were going to move him and desecrate him anyway, because we're not talking about any of those other saints here today. So maybe his movement and desecration is remembered by history.
Yeah, well, the Synod of Ravenna accuses other people of having dug the body up and thrown it in the river.
His advisors.
Yeah, but maybe lay people seeking treasure, but there would have been no treasure. I mean, in his tomb,
Popes didn't often have grave goods like Egyptian pharaohs.
Grave goods. So that doesn't make much sense, unless, of course, they were seeking relics, maybe. But then they wouldn't have thrown the body in the Tiber. Or they might have kept some of it. But there is a later inventory of a church in Paris that no longer exists that says that among the relics listed are bones of Pope Formosus, and I'd love to know where those are now, if they are somewhere, and how they got there, and whether they were actually his bones or bones that, some relics that were given to the church by earlier by Pope Formosus when he was in exile in France. Because he did, apparently, it was said that he gave relics to some other churches. He gave a relic to a church in Sens, where in fact he spent most of his time when he was in exile there. So that's another question. But as you said, both I think the Synod of Ravenna, or the Cadaver Synod, said it was not judging a pope because he wasn't a pope. He was not a valid pope. He should have never been pope. So basically, it was not judging a pope. It was judging this person who had usurped the papacy. That was their claim as to why they could not be seen as judging a pope. The Synod of Ravenna, again, they refer to Stephen VI in good terms. He was their predecessor and of pious memory. And that was remarked on by even Cardinal Baronius, who wrote this huge history of the Church in the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation period. But they said they were not judging a pope, and they even one of the great evidences for the Cadaver Synod itself, although it doesn't tell us a great deal, is this what's called the protocol to the Synod of Ravenna, which is really an interrogation of the people who took part. And it's kind of interesting. Unfortunately, they don't say much about what they did. Most of them just say they took part. Some say they didn't take part in it. Some say they took part, but they were forced to, and things like that. But so it's an interesting thing. It was apparently a small synod, this Cadaver Synod. It was only Stephen VI and his some people close to him, some bishops who were close to him, and some of the others who took part in the interrogation. One of them, for instance, was Bishop John of Arezzo, who took part in the interrogation. He did not take part in the Cadaver Synod, but was one of the leaders of in the Synod of Ravenna, and he was one of the bishops who went with Formosus to invite Charles the Bald to become emperor. So he again was a close associate of Formosus at one time.
So they were almost doing to Stephen in a way what Stephen was doing to Formosus, much more tastefully, not digging him up.
Their thing was they were judging this synod, that this synod should not have taken place, and the synod was wrong. But they were not judging the Pope. So they annulled the synod.
Yeah, but they let him lie and prevented what could have been a long, embarrassing chain of the different factions.
Well, again, Sergius III, as again, did revive this thing again. And he again, now, it's said that he held a synod, sometimes said that he held a synod, but we have no record of that he actually held a synod to again judge Formosus and declare. But he did maybe he annulled Formosus's ordinations and things, but that didn't last very long. And this was done. Nothing was ever, he did not really annul the Synod of Ravenna. And so it was not, so whatever he did not last. He did write a letter to the Bishop of Uzès at one time, saying, where he again said that Formosus was a terrible person and not and was condemned and things like this. But so he didn't accept this revision, but he died, and then it basically everybody got over it. But that was the key, I think, of the Synod of Ravenna. It was to get past this. They didn't want to, condemn Stephen VI. They didn't want to, and they didn't want to. I mean, they forgave most of the people who took part in it. But they did not want this to carry on. It was a real spot on the papacy, a real blemish on the history of the papacy, sort of, and they saw it as that, and they just wanted to get past it. And
it's hard to follow the rules of due process when it's a corpse.
What do you think in the end? Was this something that carried through with the papacy and with the church in Rome whenever they were making decisions? Was this ever in the back of their mind that
I think it certainly was. I haven't looked into this, but I know, I mean, it does come up again in later things. It'd be interesting to follow it further. I mean, it does get mentioned during the Reformation, of course, as a terrible thing that, this is how bad the papacy is that they would do these things. So something like this and everything. But Formosus is usually looked upon as in a not a bad way by the reformers and people who write about him from the reform side, from the Reformation, leaders of the Reformation and writers of the Reformation. He is not condemned, but the papacy itself is for that it would do something like this. And I think, I want to look at this up and do more work on this. And that is, the issue comes up in the First Vatican Council in the 19th century, where the issue of papal infallibility is proclaimed as a point of doctrine. I mean, it was never really a point of doctrine until then. And to say that the Pope is infallible in his official proclamations and things like that. So when this happened in the First Vatican Council, this issue comes up. But I haven't looked into the records to see where it comes up. I looked at the Acts, and the Acts don't mention it. I mean, the canons themselves don't mention it, but it comes up in the discussions.
You've done all this work on this great piece of drama and history. Do you have next steps you plan for this?
Well, I want to publish this as a book. That doesn't mean that my conclusions are actually, fully accepted or fully known, of course. And although I put all my main conclusions on the website that come from the dissertation, but I don't have all the proof for them or all my evidence. And as I say, I don't have a lot of proof. I mean, I can't prove some of the things, but it's just a matter of piecing everything together and reorganizing the puzzle to put it together in a way that I think makes more sense than the earlier explanations. And there is a lot of evidence, but it may be circumstantial evidence. It may be just supposition in some ways. Well, this just makes more sense than the other explanation, or something like that. When you look at the entire career of Formosus, you just get a different picture of. I mean, I don't see the evidence that he had this great ambition and he wanted to be bishop of Bulgaria. I don't, or that he wanted to become pope or things like that. So
it's interesting, how it makes you think how often in history are there these little things that we're accepting as true that may be tangential to what we're talking about, or maybe that just because there aren't many sources, because there aren't, just kind of sneak in there. And then, when you take a close look back, you find out something different.
I like to read this Louis Duchesne's book, which is Duchesne's the early history of the papal state. I think he writes about this. The reason, his reason. He says that Lambert and his mother Adgeltrude forced Pope Stephen VI to convene a synod to consider the fitness of Formosus for the papal office. And they say he was the creature of the Spolatans, that Stephen VI was the creature of the Spolatans. But in fact, Stephen VI became Pope while Arnulf was still emperor. It's still actually controlling Rome. When Arnulf left Rome, he left a governor, someone in his place to govern Rome and protect Rome. And that's when Stephen VI became Pope. So Formosus died. There was another Pope who lived only a couple of weeks. He was an old man, and Formosus was also an old man by this time. He was said to be in his 80s. this other pope was also very old and lived only 2 weeks and died. And then Stephen VI became pope. And Stephen, we only have, I think, 3 letters of Stephen VI. He was only pope for about a year, but the first letter is dated in the reign of Arnulf, of the Emperor Arnulf, in the first year of the reign of Emperor Arnulf. And the next 2 letters are dated in the reign of the Emperor Lambert. So that was after Arnulf had gone back to Germany. So Stephen VI, if he was the creature of the Spolatans, why did he date his first letter that we have from him in the reign of the Emperor Arnulf? It was Arnulf's people who made Stephen VI the Pope, not the Spolatans. So I think that's good evidence of that. But Duchenne, my favorite thing of Duchenne's, and I have to say, like I said, Louis Duchenne was a great historian of the papacy. He was and he was the head of the French school in Rome, for many years, and he was the only modern editor of the Liber Pontificalis. So he was a really great historian. But I think he fell a little off in this one, where he says, Formosus had betrayed the house of Spoleto, having treacherously abetted and consecrated the barbarian candidate. Notice the barbarian candidate. Louis Duchenne earlier in this book says that the papacy always preferred the French line of the Carolingians because they were more civilized. And the German one was more barbarian. I think he's got a nationalistic bias there, for one thing. So he said he had consecrated the barbarian candidate. He had now been dead and buried for 9 months, but even the mysteries of death and the tomb were not sacred before the unholy rage of the daughter of Adalgis, for she, almost beyond a doubt, was the real instigator of the crime carried out by Pope Stephen VI, the pitiable tool of her vengeance. So it was this powerful woman whose son had been wronged who took vengeance on Formosus.
And I guess in the end, you can say that that he was creating his story based on the evidence at hand.
Yes.
And you're allowed to reevaluate that same evidence that he used.
Sure. I think he had a bit of the nationalistic bias and also maybe some misogyny there.
And you're covering a lot of popes. You gotta cut corners and assume some things at some point.
I mean, so he was a great historian. I don't want to disparage him in that sense, but we all have our biases, our flaws.
A lot of people, I think, just tend not to sweat the details in like the 800s that you've kind of gone back and done. So.
Yeah.
And he wrote these things in the first decade of the 20th century. So
well, I want to thank you so much for your time. This has been fascinating. It's awesome. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.